Hello students. In this video I'm going to read and briefly discuss the poems that are assigned for week 2, which is 2 poems by Elizabeth Bishop, 2 poems by Gwendolyn Brooks, and 1 poem by Philip Larkin. We'll start with One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day. Accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster. Places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last, or next to last, of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster. So this week we are talking about lyric and narrative poetry, and I made the claim earlier in the week that most poems, if not all good poems, have aspects of both narrative and lyric in them. Lyric poetry focuses more on one moment of emotion. And here we have a poem that, while it has a narrative, you can draw a series of events starting from the beginning of the poem through the end. The main focus of the poem appears to be on this final stanza and the feeling, the emotion that our speaker has when thinking about losing the you, the audience for this poem. Let's start though with our 3 questions. What do we know about the speaker? Well, there's someone who loses things. They have lost things ranging from door keys to a continent, although we could debate how one can lose a continent. It seems perhaps more like that's a metaphor for something that is actually important, even though our speaker claims that these losses aren't a disaster. And that's the other thing we know about the speaker. They lose these things, they're used to it, they're accustomed to it. They don't think that it's a big problem, or at least that's what they claim. We also have an audience here. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. So the you has a joking voice, the you has a gesture that the speaker loves. And notice that that is not past tense, a gesture I love in the present. So the audience, rather, is someone that the speaker loves. And so what? What is our change? What has happened for our speaker? To me, this poem reads like someone who is insisting that they're fine after a breakup or after something happens to ruin a relationship. They are lying about being fine, and you can tell, I'm not lying, I'm not lying. Our speaker is trying to convince the audience, maybe trying to convince themselves that this loss is not a disaster, but they have trouble completing the thought at the end. They have to force themselves to finish the sentence that says that this is not a disaster. We have other hints about this in the narrative, or rather in the way the poem is structured. We start out in our second stanza with losing lost door keys. We lose door keys, we lose an hour badly spent looking for them. Then we lose farther and faster. We lose places and names where it was you meant to travel. And then the mother's watch. This you could read as giving us a little bit more about the speaker. Maybe the speaker is a woman. Usually a mother's watch would be handed down to a female child. That isn't always the case, so we can't necessarily read that as giving us more information about the speaker. But a mother's watch is going to be more important to a speaker than forgetting someone's name. And losing a house, however you want to imagine that, maybe they fought with the people who lived there, or maybe a house that they owned burned down or was condemned. Whatever, a house is going to be more important. And then we move even larger. Cities, some realms, 2 rivers, a continent. Again, it's hard to say how someone loses a continent, but again, we might be thinking of, okay, that person is now banned from traveling to Australia for whatever reason. And if we draw a shape for how these losses go, it's a pyramid. From the top, we're losing small things, and then things that are lost get larger and larger as the poem moves on. And after a continent, we have you, the joking voice, a gesture I love. So if we're reading this as escalating toward the end of the poem, the you is the most important thing that the speaker has lost. And they're trying to convince themselves that they're okay. Which makes the poem, which otherwise has a sort of playful feel, there's the repeated rhymes, the internal rhymes, fluster of lost door keys. That's a cool line. It's a fun poem to read, but when you figure out that this speaker is actually falling apart because of having lost this person, the poem loses a lot of that luster. The Moose by Elizabeth Bishop, which was written for Grace Bulmer Bowers. From narrow provinces of fish and bread and tea, home of the long tides where the bay leaves the sea twice a day and takes the herring's long rides, where if the river enters or retreats in a wall of brown foam depends on if it meets the bay coming in, the bay not at home, where, silted red, sometimes the sun sets facing a red sea, and others veins the flats lavender, rich mud in burning rivulets. On red, gravelly roads, down rows of sugar maples, past clapboard farmhouses and neat clapboard churches, bleached, ridged as clamshells, past twin silver birches. Through late afternoon, a bus journeys west, the windshield flashing pink, pink glancing off of metal, brushing the dented flank of blue, beat-up enamel. Down hollows, up rises, and waits, patient, while a lone traveler gives kisses and embraces to 7 relatives and a collie supervises. Goodbye to the elms, to the farm, to the dog. The bus starts. The light grows richer. The fog, shifting, salty, thin, comes closing in. Its cold, round crystals form and slide and settle in the white hen's feathers, in gray glazed cabbages, on the cabbage roses and lupins like apostles. The sweet peas cling to their wet white string on the whitewashed fences. Bumblebees creep inside the foxgloves, and evening commences. One stop at Bass River, then the economies, lower, middle, upper, 5 islands, 5 houses, where a woman shakes a tablecloth out after supper. A pale flickering, gone. The Tantramar marshes and the smell of salt hay. An iron bridge trembles and a loose plank rattles, but doesn't give way. On the left, a red light swims through the dark. A ship's port lantern. 2 rubber boots show, illuminated, solemn. A dog gives one bark. A woman climbs in with 2 market bags, brisk, freckled, elderly. A grand night. Yes, sir, all the way to Boston. She regards us amicably. Moonlight as we enter the New Brunswick woods. Hairy, scratchy, splintery. Moonlight and mist caught in them like lamb's wool on bushes in a pasture. The passengers lie back. Snores. Some long sighs. A dreamy divagation begins in the night, a gentle, auditory, slow hallucination. In the creakings and noises, an old conversation, not concerning us, but recognizable, somewhere, back in the bus, grandparents' voices, uninterruptedly talking in eternity, names being mentioned, things cleared up finally. What he said, what she said, who got pensioned, deaths and sicknesses, the year he remarried, the year something happened. She died in childbirth. That was the son lost when the schooner foundered. He took to drink. Yes, she went to the bad. When Amos began to pray, even in the store, and finally the family had to put him away. Yes, that peculiar affirmative, yes, a sharp, indrawn breath, half groan, half acceptance, that means life's like that. We know it, also death. Talking the way they talked in the old featherbed, peacefully on and on, dim lamplight in the hall, down in the kitchen, the dog tucked in her shawl. Now, it's all right now, even to fall asleep, just as on all those nights. Suddenly, the bus driver stops with a jolt, turns off his lights. A moose has come out of the impenetrable wood and stands there, looms, rather, in the middle of the road. It approaches. It sniffs at the bus's hot hood. Towering, antlerless, high as a church, homely as a house, or safe as houses, a man's voice assures us, perfectly harmless. Some of the passengers exclaim in whispers, childishly, softly, sure are big creatures. It's awful plain. Look, it's a she. Taking her time, she looks the bus over. Grand, otherworldly. Why do we all feel, this sweet sensation of joy? Curious creatures, says our quiet driver, rolling his R's. Look at that, would you? Then he shifts gears. For a moment longer, by craning backward, the moose can be seen on the moonlit macadam. Then there's a dim smell of moose, an acrid smell of gasoline. So, unlike one art by Bishop, which is primarily a lyric poem, The Moose is primarily a narrative poem. And the story that it tells is of a speaker who gets on a bus that has already traveled a long way and then rides on the bus, which we know is going to Boston. And they hear people talking on the bus that reminds them of grandparents' voices. And when they hear those grandparents' voices, they feel comforted. They feel as though it's all right for them to go to sleep on the bus, which apparently they didn't feel comfortable doing that before. And then we have this incident with the moose, which is so important that it ends the poem. And remember, poems build up to a moment at the end, usually. And not only that, but it is also the title of the poem, The Moose. So this lyric moment at the end where the moose takes on such great importance to our speaker. This is there's debate about this, is I guess what I'll say. Um, this final stanza, we see our speaker craning backward to peer at the moose out the windows of the bus. And then there's the dim smell of moose and acrid smell of gasoline. And the acrid means bitter, the bitter smell of gasoline. Not a great positive image to end the poem on after this powerful image of the moose. But we do have some more information. We knew from the first line where the word provinces is used. That's a hint of where the poem is starting out, where the bus is starting out, which is in Canada. And we know that the bus is headed toward Boston. And there are hints in here of the age of our speaker. And we know, or we can guess, that the speaker is relatively young. She is comforted by the sound of grandparents' voices, and hearing those people talk and being reminded of the speaker's grandparents allows the speaker to fall asleep when they weren't able to do so before. So I would say that the speaker is pretty young. So what can that moose mean to a speaker who is going from Canada to Boston? And why, when the moose is gone, do we have that bitter feeling, that bitter smell of gasoline at the end when the moose is gone? I'm going to leave this for you to consider. 2 poems by Gwendolyn Brooks, We Real Cool and The Bean Eaters. We Real Cool. The Pool Players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. And you'll notice when I read that, I'm pausing at the end of the line instead of pausing where the punctuation tells me to pause. This is not the usual way that I read poetry. It's not the way that I was taught to read poetry. But there is a recording of Gwendolyn Brooks reading this poem, and that's where she puts the pauses. So that's where I put the pauses. She certainly knows what she's doing. All right, so let's talk about We Real Cool. We have here a narrative, believe it or not. There's a story that is told here, or maybe you can see it pretty clearly. We have a group of pool players at the Golden Shovel. There are 7 of them. Surprise. They are very cool. They dropped out of school or ditched school. They hang out late into the night. They strike straight. I always take that as they're playing pool and they're good at it, so they do this a lot. They sing sin. They celebrate the fact that they are doing something they think is wrong. They thin gin, which is drinking gin that's been watered down. So maybe they're young and they can't afford or aren't allowed to buy as much gin as they want. They jazz June. They live it up in the summertime. And they die soon. So either our speakers here, the we is the speaker, so it's a plural speaker, and I assume it's the pool players. We die soon. There are a couple ways to think about this. This is the lyric moment of the poem. This is what everything's building up to. Is that knowledge of mortality, the knowledge that the pool players have that they are going to die soon. And this could be a judgment on the way that they're acting, the way that they're behaving here. It could also be the reason for them to claim their lives and to live them as they want. The phrase "live fast, die young." There are two ways to think about that. So these people, the speakers here, are seizing life. They are doing what they want to do because they know that life is too short to do all of the things that other people tell them to do. The bean eaters. They eat beans mostly, this old yellow pair. Dinner is a casual affair. Plain chipware on a plain and creaking wood, tin flatware. Two who are mostly good, two who have lived their day, but keep putting on their clothes and putting things away. And remembering with twinklings and twinges as they lean over the beans in their rented back room that is full of beads and receipts and dolls and cloths, tobacco crumbs, vases, and fringes. Real quick, I want to point out that these final two lines here are actually one line, but I couldn't get them all to fit on one line on a page without making the font absurdly small. So this is all one long line that stands out in the poem. And we know from looking at We Real Cool that Brooks is very careful with her line breaks. Another word for that is lineation. So the Bean Eaters, we have a story. These old people who are not very wealthy, eat beans mostly. They've lived their day. Most of their lives are behind them. But they keep going. They keep putting on their clothes and putting things away. And what do they do with their time? They remember with twinklings and twinges. And I always read that as twinklings are the positive, the good things. Twinges are the negative things, the things they regret. As they lean over the beans in the rented back room that is full of all of this stuff, and beads and receipts, dolls and claws, tobacco crumbs, vases and fringes. Like, most of that sounds kind of like trash, like clutter to me. But for these people, those are their memories. That's what sparks them to remember the lives that they had, the lives that are behind them. And our lyric moment again is at the end, and we see this long life that's stretched out behind them that they have to think about. So while an outsider may look at them and think that their life is miserable and sad, they actually have a very rich inner life. Something that makes them happy to get up every day, eat their beans, and then go to bed and do it again the next day. The last poem for the week is Obad by Philip Larkin. Obad means song for the dawn, and it's typically sung between two lovers who are parting in the morning, who know that they will see each other again in the evening. So here's Larkin's Obad. I work all day and get half drunk at night. Waking at 4 to soundless dark, I stare. In time, the curtain edges will grow light. Till then, I see what's really always there. Unresting death, a whole day nearer now, making all thought impossible, but how and where and when I shall myself die. Arid interrogation, yet the dread of dying and being dead flashes afresh to hold and horrify. The mind blanks at the glare. not in remorse, the good not done, the love not given, time torn off unused, nor wretchedly because an only life can take so long to climb clear of its wrong beginnings, and may never, but at the total emptiness forever, the sure extinction that we travel to and shall be lost in always, not to be here, not to be anywhere, and soon. Nothing more terrible, nothing more true. This is a special way of being afraid no trick dispels. Religion used to try, that vast, moth-eaten musical brocade created to pretend we never die, and specious stuff that says no rational being can fear a thing it will not feel, not seeing that this is what we fear. No sight, no sound, no touch or taste or smell, nothing to think with, nothing to love or link with, the anesthetic from which none come round. And so it stays just on the edge of vision, a small, unfocused blur, a standing chill that slows each impulse down to indecision. Most things may never happen. This one will. And realization of it rages out in furnace fear when we are caught without people or drink. Courage is no good. It means not scaring others. Being brave lets no one off the grave. Death is no different whined at than withstood. Slowly, light strengthens and the room takes shape. It stands plain as a wardrobe, what we know, have always known, know that we can't escape, yet can't accept. One side will have to go. Meanwhile, telephones crouch, getting ready to ring in locked-up offices, and all the uncaring, intricate, rented world begins to rouse. The sky is white as clay, with no sun. Work has to be done. Postmen, like doctors, go from house to house. Now, this poem is interesting in that the whole thing is kind of a narrative where we have our speaker working all day, getting half drunk, and then going to sleep and waking up at 4, where they think all of the thoughts that happen throughout most of the rest of the poem until the sun comes up enough for them to see things and they think about having to go to work again. So that is the narrative, but the entire center of the poem is all that captured lyric moment of our speaker's terror of death that they know will happen to them at some point. And each day it's getting closer and closer. So this is a narrative with a lyric moment captured in the middle. I find it interesting for that. Another thing that I think is interesting about this poem is that I've made the claim a few times that poetry focuses on concrete, vivid details that appeal to the senses. But here we see those. There's a little bit at the beginning. In time, the curtain edges will grow light. But then we have very few concrete details until the very last stanza of the poem. And the reason for that is twofold. First, most of the poem takes place in soundless dark. Our speaker is awake. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. It is dark everywhere. They can't see anything. So there's nothing to describe. But the other part of it is that lack of sensory detail is supposed to mirror what our speaker is thinking of and is afraid of. When we're dead, we aren't going to sense anything. We won't, what does it say here? No sight, no sound, no touch or taste or smell. So we have stanzas that are completely without detail that we can attach to, that we can imagine. And that's what our poet has given us in most of these stanzas.